Hello, this is Rabbi Abramson. This week's Torah portion is Parashat Eikev. And I want to talk to you today about a central prayer in Judaism, one which is found in Parashat Eikev, one with which you might be relatively unfamiliar. If I were to say it's one of the paragraphs of the Shema, you might think of the first paragraph of the Shema, often called V'ahavta, because it begins with the phrase, V'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha, you shall love Adonai your God. Or you might think of the third paragraph of the Shema, known as Parashat Tzitzit, the passage that speaks of the ritual fringes that we wear on a four-cornered garment known as a talit. But the passage from this week's Torah portion that I want to talk to you about is the second paragraph of the Shema, and it doesn't even have a popular nickname like the other two. Some people call it V'haya im Shamoa, which are the first three words of the passage. Sometime in the middle of my Hebrew school career, that would have been sometime in the late 1960s, it became more and more common in the conservative synagogue in which I grew up, and in many others, for us to chant the first paragraph of the Shema according to the Torah reading cantillation. This was probably due to the increasing prevalence of congregational Torah readers, replacing the hired Baal Kriya, who typically read most or all of the weekly Torah portion. So we became increasingly familiar with the ta'amim, with Torah cantillation, by chanting those melodies, not only hearing other people chant them. We became more used to singing, V'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha, and so on. And so we became more familiar with the first paragraph of the Shema itself, V'ahavta. It's probably a fair assumption that most people who grew up in most conservative synagogues in the 1970s and beyond know that paragraph of the Shema by heart, or mostly by heart. By the mid-1970s, in my experience, the third paragraph of the Shema, Parashat Tzitzit, was increasingly chanted aloud in synagogues as well. This was probably due to the pedagogic desirability of modeling the choreography of the Tzitzit, gathering them together before the Shema, and then kissing them at various times during and following the third paragraph. As a result, of course, many people who grew up in conservative synagogues in that period and subsequently also know the third paragraph of the Shema, mostly or entirely by heart. And then there's the second paragraph of the Shema, V'haya im Shamoa, which is in this week's Torah portion, and none of us knows it completely by heart. In fact, the most common pattern in many conservative synagogues, in my experience in the past 4.5 decades, is to chant the first or the first and third paragraphs most of the time, and to chant the second paragraph of the Shema almost never, and in most synagogues, absolutely never. But around 15 years ago, I introduced the practice of chanting all three paragraphs of the Shema in the synagogue that I then served, and it became a regular part of our Shabbat and Yom Tov liturgical experience with the expected pedagogic benefits. There was a time, not too many years ago, that I knew that second paragraph by heart. But these days I don't chant or hear it aloud too often. But I am committed to this practice, not only on pedagogic grounds. We make a statement, a theological statement, when we take the Shema, one of the central prayers of our morning and evening services, and chant the first and third sections while virtually ignoring the second section. So let's take a close look at the second paragraph of the Shema, taken from Parashat Eikev, consisting of Deuteronomy chapter 11, verses 13 to 21. V'haya im shamoa tishma'u el mitzvotai asher anochi mitzaveh etchem hayom. If you will hear and obey my mitzvot that I give you this day, La'ahava et Adonai Elohechem, ul ovdo b'chol levavechem, uv'chol nafshechem, to love and serve Adonai your God with all your heart and with all your soul. V'natati mitar artzechem be'ito, then I will favor your land with rain at the proper season, yoreh u'malkosh, rain in autumn and rain in spring. Ve'asavta deganecha v'tiroshecha v'yitzharecha, and you will have ample harvest of grain and wine and oil. V'natati eser b'sadecha livhemtecha, I will assure abundance in the fields for your cattle. V'achalta v'savata, and you will eat to contentment. So far, so good. But the paragraph goes on. Hishamaru lachem pen yifteh levavechem. Take care lest you be tempted. V'sartem v'avadetem Elohim acherim v'hishtachavitem lahem. Tempted to forsake God and turn to false gods in worship. V'chara af Adonai bachem, for then the wrath of Adonai will be directed against you. V'atzar et hashamayim v'lo yematar, God will close the heavens and hold back the rain. V'ha'adama lo titen et yivulah, the earth will not yield its produce. V'avadetem mehera me'al ha'aretz hatova asher Adonai noten lachem, you will soon disappear from the good land which Adonai is giving you. V'samtem et devarai ele al levavchem v'al nafshechem, therefore impress these words of mine upon your heart. Ukshartem otam laot al yedchem, v'hayu letotafot bein einechem, bind them as a sign upon your hand, and let them be a symbol above your eyes. V'limadetem otam et b'nechem, teach them to your children. L'daber bam b'shiftecha b'veitecha, uv'lechtecha v'aderech, uv'shochbecha, uv'kumecha, reciting them home and away, evening and morning. Uchtavtam al mezuzot beitecha, uvish arecha, inscribe them upon the doorposts of your homes and upon your gates. Lema'an yirbu yimechem v'imei v'nechem al ha'adama, asher nishba Adonai la'avotechem latet lahem ki mei hashamayim al haaretz. Then your days and the days of your children on the land which Adonai swore to give to your ancestors will endure as the days of the heavens over the earth. Now I know why the pattern in most synagogues, even where the first and third paragraphs of the Shema are chanted, is to mumble our way through V'haya im Shamoa. In fact, I had a homiletics professor in rabbinical school, himself one of the most illustrious East Coast rabbis of his generation, who told us proudly and affirmatively, in my shul, we skip the second paragraph of the Shema entirely. I don't accept its theology, so we don't say it. Now, my professor was, partly in a generational sense, very much influenced by Mordecai Kaplan, by Kaplan's theology, and by Kaplan's perspective on liturgical experience. And Kaplan, as well as many Kaplanians who have followed him, was very much committed to the notion, if we don't believe it, we shouldn't say it. If we don't believe it, we shouldn't say it in our prayers. And I understand why the second paragraph of the Shema is problematic for many contemporary Jews. It presents the reward and punishment schema in the Bible clearly. If you're faithful to God's commandments, God will reward you. If you're not faithful to God's commandments, God will punish you. The notion of reward and punishment is central in biblical theology, and no less so, though in different ways, in classical rabbinic theology. And so it's no surprise to see it prominent in that textbook of rabbinic theology that is the Siddur, our traditional prayer book. But that's the problem for many contemporary Jews, and it did not just start in the years during and following World War II. Some contemporary people like to think that the Holocaust made us discover the flaws in the traditional reward and punishment schema, but the theological problems of this notion go far beyond and far predate the Nazi Holocaust. Many of us have abundant grounds from our own life experience to doubt the traditional notion that God rewards and punishes us for our mitzvot and our avirot. Or to put it another way, the notion that if things are going well for us, we deserve it, and if things are going badly for us, we deserve that as well. It's all about God rewarding us for our good behavior and punishing us for our bad behavior, and there's the rub. Rabbi Harold Kushner's When Bad Things Happen to Good People became a bestseller almost 40 years ago, not only because it was so well written and so sensitively presented. It tapped a well of theological struggle that readers, Jews and non-Jews, drew from extensively, as people had been struggling with the issue of theodicy, undeserved suffering, and the problem of God's power and God's goodness for countless generations. I once had a very striking conversation with Rabbi Alan W. Miller, the brilliant successor to Rabbi Mordecai Kaplan at the mothership of the Reconstructionist movement, the Society for the Advancement of Judaism on Manhattan's Upper West Side. "What prayer book do you think I use on Shabbat mornings at SAJ?" Rabbi Miller asked me. I responded that I presumed it was the latest iteration of the Reconstructionist prayer book. "No," he said, "I use Birnbaum. Rabbi Philip Birnbaum's daily prayer book and Shabbat and holiday prayer book, standard traditional editions of the Siddur, were pretty prevalent in those days in some conservative synagogues and in many Orthodox shuls. But I was frankly surprised to hear this illustrious Reconstructionist rabbi telling me that he davened from an Orthodox Siddur on Shabbat mornings. When I opened my Siddur," Rabbi Miller explained to me that day in 1980, "I don't want simply to say those things, to see those things that conform to my own theology. When I open my Siddur, I want to struggle also with those aspects of traditional Jewish theology that I don't necessarily believe." It would be only slightly overstating to say that I had an epiphany that afternoon in Rabbi Miller's study. That conversation stayed with me for many years, and the insights that grew from that conversation continued to blossom and continue to influence my theological life, and more importantly, my prayer life. And that's one of the reasons that I'm so committed to chanting the second paragraph of the Shema aloud, or at the very least, to paying particular attention to that paragraph. Not because I accept its theology, but dafka because I struggle with it. And I need to confront the biblical and rabbinic notion of reward and punishment. I need to rub my nose in it, so to speak, because it's a central part of my theological heritage. It's a central part of our theological heritage. It's not only that historically speaking, it was central to the theology of the biblical authors and of the rabbis in Talmudic times. It's why it was central that resonates in my soul. Though the reward and punishment schema creates theological problems, especially for contemporary people perhaps, it also solves, or at least addressed, a central theological problem for our ancestors, namely the apparent randomness of life experience. Good things happen, bad things happen. It's all a matter of random, purposeless life. And this wasn't enough for our ancestors. They didn't want to live in a world that reflected what in recent centuries we have called deism, the theological notion that God created the world in all of its complexity and amazingness and then left it alone. For the deist, God isn't here. God is just the cosmic watchmaker who did the cosmic watchmaking a little less than 6,000 years ago, or perhaps a little less than 14 billion years ago. But God hasn't been around since. That kind of God, or more specifically, that kind of God absence, was unthinkable to our forebears. They needed a God who intervened in history, not only who took them out of Egypt, or led them to Sinai, or caused the temple to be destroyed because of their sinfulness, or led them back to Jerusalem in an act of breathtaking forgiveness. They needed a God who intervened in personal history as well. A God who gave children to previously infertile couples, who gave prosperity to hard-working shepherds and farmers, who gave affirmation and recognition to good, decent, mitzvah-doing folk. Yeah, but what about the Holocaust? And what about the Black Death that killed a third of the world's population in the 14th century? And what about the tsunami of 2004? And what about my son's epilepsy? And what about FDR's polio? And while we're on the subject, what about COVID-19, which has killed close to 160,000 Americans so far and has devastated all of our lives? And what about Job and all of his suffering, whether or not he really existed? And what about Rabbi Akiva's being tortured to death by the Romans, about which Moses himself complained to God, Zo Torah, v'zo sechara, this is the Torah, and this is its reward? But what about a world in which our behavior doesn't really matter, in which we can live our lives however we want, because God neither rewards nor punishes? I don't want to live in the world of Monsieur Thénardier. It's a world where the dog eats the dog, and they kill for the bones in the street, and God in his heavens, he don't interfere cause he's dead. I need that second paragraph of the Shema. Not because the idea of divine reward and punishment is easy to believe in, but because it's so difficult and because it's so important. I need the second paragraph of the Shema to help me learn the lessons that our actions have consequences, that we don't live in a morally neutral world, that God cares about how we live our lives. And if I don't believe in reward and punishment in the same way that my great-grandparents believed in it, then I need the second paragraph of the Shema to force me to figure out how it is that I believe in divine reward and punishment. And maybe, just maybe, the growing theological complexity that we're challenged to develop, the growing spiritual depth that our prayers might stimulate, maybe that's the reward. Maybe that's the point of the Haya'im Shamoah. Shabbat Shalom.